This video recording provides the steps to be followed for invoking APIs implemented for study definition repository reference implementation using Postman. Legal disclaimer. These materials and information are provided by Transliterate Biopharma Inc. as is. Any party using or relying on this information and these materials do so entirely at their own risk. Neither Transliterate nor its member will bear any responsibility or liability for any harm, including indirect or consequential harm that a user may incur from use or misuse of this information. The recording covers the below endpoints. SDR reference implementation exposes the REST endpoints to deliver application functionality, including storing and retrieving study definitions in USDM format. Post token generation, post study definition, get study definition, get study design, get audit trail, get study history. Postman setup. Before invoking the SDR APIs using Postman, the client certificate required for authentication must be added and configured in Postman. Obtain client certificate and passphrase from Azure Administrator. To add certificate, click Settings. Under Certificates tab, click Add Certificate. In the host, add SDR APIM hostname. Click Select File under PFX file and add the downloaded certificate. In the passphrase, add the passphrase for the certificate. Then click Add. Now the certificate is configured for SDR API. Post endpoints. Post endpoints are used to create access token and create or update existing study definitions in SDR. First, post token generation. For accessing API endpoints, authorization header should contain access token. For this, token generation endpoint creates access token against pre-registered user credentials. For generating access token in the Postman, create new HTTP request. Select post and in the URL tab, enter the base URL. Then followed by the endpoint URL which is mentioned in the API user guide. In the request body, the username and password have to be sent so that it would be validated for the pre-registered users. After adding the username and password, click Send. The access token will be generated in the response. Copy the access token so that it can be used to add it as a header for the other API endpoints. Next endpoint is post add study definition. For creating a new study definition in Postman, create a new HTTP request. Select post in the URL. the API base URL must be added, then followed by the endpoint URL which is mentioned in the API user guide. Under Authorization tab, select bearer token. The token which was copied earlier must be added. In the request body, select raw and JSON. The JSON data which conforms to USDM conformance rules must be sent in the request body. For the first time when a study is pushed into SDR, the UUID fields must be empty. SDR will generate the UUIDs for these fields. Then click send. The response will have whole study with UUID generated for each UUID fields. The UUID for study can be copied so that it can be used in get endpoints. Next, post study update. For adding new elements to an existing study definition, the new element should be sent along with the existing elements with SDR generated UUIDs. The existing elements with their IDs are not sent in the request. Those elements will be removed during the update. SDR will generate UUID for only the new elements mentioned in the request and update the data for existing UUID elements with valid UUIDs. For example, if the study objective section have to be added, then the whole study with a new study objectives must be sent in the request. To update an existing study, create a new HTTP request, select post, and the URL is same as post study definition URL. In the authorization, select bearer token and add the existing token. In the request body, select raw JSON. The whole study which is in response must be added in the request body. A new element for study objectives must be added in the study objectives section. A new study objectives must be added. The UUID for the new study objective section will be generated by SDR. Then click send. A new version for the existing study will be created with version 2. And the study objective section will have two elements. Next, post conformant rules. All the API should conform to the USDM format. For reference implementation, only required field validation have been included. If any mandatory fields are missing or empty and a post request is sent, the system will throw a 400 bad request and the response will show on which element there is a conformance error. For example, Study title is a mandatory field. When a request is sent after removing that title, then system will throw a bad request with an appropriate error message. The next is get endpoints. Get endpoints are used for retrieving study definition and related information that are in SDR. Get study definitions. Get study definition allows user to retrieve different study elements for a particular study for a specific SDR upload version. To invoke this API, create a new HTTP request and select get. Then add APIM URL. Then followed by URL for get study elements, which is mentioned in the API user guide. Then in the authorization tab, select bearer token, add the token which was copied earlier. Then click send. Instead of study ID, add the study ID which was copied earlier. Then click send. The response will have the entire study which was pushed earlier, and SDR will by default retrieve the latest version of that particular study. In addition to that, an SDR upload version query parameter also can be sent to retrieve a particular version. SDR upload version is an optional query parameter. Next is get audit trail endpoint. The audit trail endpoint retrieves the audit trail details for a particular study definition that are pushed in SDR. To invoke that API, add a new HTTP request, select get. In the URL, first add APIM base URL. Then followed by the endpoint URL which is mentioned in the API user guide for audit trail. In the authorization tab, select bearer token and add the existing token which we have copied earlier. Then then add the existing UUID which was copied earlier. Then click send. The response will have the audit trail details for a particular study ID. In addition to that, a from date to date query parameters can be added to fetch the audit trail details for a particular date range. Next, get study design endpoint. This endpoint is used to retrieve study design elements for a particular study. To invoke this API, add a new HTTP request, select get, add APIM base URL, then followed by study design URL which is mentioned in the API user guide. In the authorization tab, select bearer token, add token which was copied earlier. Then in the parameter, A query parameter has to be sent with study UUID to fetch the UUID for a particular study. In that parameter, pass the study ID which was copied earlier and click send. This will retrieve the study design details for the study UUID which was passed in the query parameter. An additional SDR upload version query parameter can also be added to retrieve the study design element for that particular SDR upload version. Study history endpoint. The get study history endpoint is used to retrieve the metadata elements for a particular study that is residing in SDR. It will retrieve all the study data which is created for past 30 days. The metadata items include study ID, study title, SDR upload version, study identifiers, and protocol version. To invoke this API, create a new HTTP request, add API and base URL, then followed by endpoint URL, which is mentioned in the API user guide. In the authorization tab, select bearer token and add the token which was created. Click send. The response will have the metadata for a particular study. Upload version, study title, study version, study identifiers, and protocol version. A from date to date parameters can also be added to retrieve studies for a date range. This will retrieve only the study details which are created on 26th August. In addition to that, study title query parameter can also be added to retrieve the study data. SDR API walkthrough is